For 35 years, I gave every piece of myself to two people, my daughter and the classroom. Every morning I woke before the sun, packed my lunch in the same brown paper bag I'd been reusing since the school district cut our stipends, and drove 40 minutes each way to Millbrook Elementary so other people's children could learn to read. I loved those kids. I loved my job, but the person I loved most in the world was my daughter. Claire, the brown-eyed girl I had raised alone after her father walked out when she was 3, and then raised again in a different way after my husband Robert died of a heart attack 11 years ago, leaving me with a quiet house and a grief I wore like a second skin for years. Claire was everything I had, and for a long time, I believed that meant she would be everything I needed. I was wrong about that. Profoundly, painfully wrong. The morning I told her I was retiring, I drove to her house in Cedarwood Hills with a grocery bag full of ingredients for her favorite meal, chicken marsala, the recipe she'd been asking me to teach her since college. I thought we'd cook together, open a bottle of wine, celebrate the end of my working life the way mothers and daughters are supposed to celebrate things. I had my retirement date circled in red on the paper calendar above my kitchen sink. June 14th. I'd circled it 3 times. Her house was beautiful in a way that always made me feel slightly out of place. My son-in-law, Derek, had done well in commercial real estate. Not well enough that Claire didn't still call me asking for help with their property taxes or the girls' private school tuition, but well enough that their kitchen had marble countertops and a refrigerator with a screen on the door. I had put in 35 years in a career that required a master's degree and paid me less per hour than Derek tipped his barber. I should have noticed something was off the moment Claire answered the door. She had the look she gets when she's rehearsed a conversation, too composed, too still. Her mother-in-law, Renee, was already there. She was seated at the kitchen island with a glass of sparkling water and the posture of someone who believed she owned every room she entered. Renee had made it clear from the beginning of Claire and Derek's marriage that she considered me a tolerable inconvenience. She was the kind of woman who referred to public school teachers as sweet in the tone people reserve for golden retrievers. I set my groceries on the counter and said I had news. I told them I was retiring in the spring. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Claire looked at Derek. Derek looked at his mother. Renee looked at me with an expression of barely concealed impatience, as if I had announced something mildly offensive at a dinner party. Retiring, Claire repeated. Not a question. A verdict. I explained that I was 63, that Robert's pension covered my basic expenses, that I was tired, truly tired, in a way I hadn't been able to admit to myself until I sat down one February night with a cup of tea and realized I had not read a book for pleasure in 4 years. I said I thought it might finally be time to live for myself a little. But your lease is up in August, Derek said, and something in his voice made my stomach drop. He wasn't asking. He was steering. I reminded them of the conversation we'd had 3 Christmases ago, when Claire had wrapped her arms around my neck and told me that when I was ready to slow down, there was always a place for me in their home, the guest suite downstairs. She'd even showed it to me, pointing out the attached bathroom, the little garden window above the sink. "You'll have your own space, Mom," she'd said. "You'll never have to worry." I watched her face carefully as I brought this up. She glanced at Derek again. "That was before," she said. "Before." Such a small word for something that large. Before what? I asked. She said things had changed. The girls were getting older and needed the downstairs for a study space. Derek had mentioned converting the guest suite into a home office for his expanding business. Renee had helpfully chimed in that assisted living communities had really evolved in recent years, that some of them were quite social, quite active. "There's one in Briar Creek," she said, "that has a work exchange program. Teachers especially, they'd love someone with your experience to tutor the younger residents." I stared at her. Then I looked at my daughter, the girl I had kept warm through 2 Illinois winters in an apartment with broken radiators by sleeping with her tucked against my chest, the girl whose college applications I had proofread at midnight after 10-hour teaching days. The girl whose wedding flowers I had arranged myself because they couldn't afford a florist that year, and I hadn't said a word about it because her happiness was my happiness, completely and without condition. She was staring at the marble countertop. "Claire," I said. "Mom, we just need to be practical." Derek folded his hands on the table. "The reality is, if you're not working, You're not contributing. And if you're not contributing, it doesn't really make financial sense for us to take on the additional. He paused, searching for a diplomatic word, and when he didn't find one, he just said, "It's burden." There it was. Burden. The word landed exactly the way those words always land, silently, completely, leaving no visible wound but changing the shape of everything. I thought of the $14,000 I had sent them 2 years ago when Derek's deal in Phoenix fell through and they couldn't make the mortgage. I had never brought it up. I had never planned to. I thought of the summers I had kept their daughters for weeks at a time so they could take vacations to places I had never been. I thought of the birthday parties, the school pickups, the nights I had driven 40 minutes in the dark because one of the girls had a fever and Claire had a work dinner she couldn't miss. I picked up my grocery bag from the counter. I put the chicken back inside. I thanked them for their time. "Mom, don't be dramatic," Claire called after me. "We're just being honest with you." I turned at the door. I told her I appreciated the honesty. I told her I would figure something out on my own. I drove home in the kind of quiet that rings. What Claire didn't know, what nobody knew, not even my sister in Phoenix, was that Robert had been meticulous about one thing in his otherwise disorganized financial life. Years before he died, while we were still living in the small house on Birchwood Lane, he had taken out a life insurance policy. A significant one. He renewed it every year without telling me the details, because he said it was his job to worry about the numbers, and my job to worry about everything else, and I had let him have that because he needed to feel useful, and I was too tired to argue about something that might never matter. It mattered. After he died, the policy took 2 years to process because of contested paperwork and a clerical error at the insurance company that I had spent 18 months correcting, mostly on my own initiative, on hold during my lunch breaks at school. By the time the money finally arrived, all $1.4 million of it, I had been teaching for 3 more years, and I had nowhere to put it but a savings account I barely looked at. I wasn't ready to do anything with it. It was Robert's last act of love for me, and spending it felt like losing him a second time. So I left it there. And I kept teaching. And I kept sending Claire money when she needed it, from my salary, because the insurance money was Robert's. It was something apart, something I hadn't earned, and couldn't quite claim as my own. Not yet. Retirement changed that. The week after the dinner at Claire's house, I called a financial advisor I'd found through the Retired Teachers Association. Her name was Susan, and she was practical and unsentimental in a way I desperately needed at that moment. She laid out my options clearly, walked me through the numbers, and at the end of our second meeting, she looked at me across her desk and said, "Margaret, you are not a woman with a problem. You are a woman with a plan who hasn't started planning yet." I went home and I started planning. My lease was up in August. I did not renew it. Instead, I put in an offer on a 2-bedroom condominium on the 14th floor of a building called Harbor View in a small coastal city called Glenport, about 2 hours from Cedarwood Hills. The building had a rooftop terrace with a view of the Atlantic that, the first time I stood on it during a showing, made me burst into tears in front of the realtor. Not sad tears. The other kind. The kind that come when you see something you've wanted for so long you'd stopped admitting you wanted it. The unit was listed at $640,000. I paid in full. The closing took 11 days. I spent August moving in quietly. I bought a couch that was ridiculous in its comfort. I hung curtains that let in the morning light. I unpacked my good dishes, the ones I'd kept in a box for 20 years waiting for an occasion worthy of them, and I used them every single day, for meals I made just for myself, and I washed them by hand in the evening while the sun went down over the water. I was careful. I told almost no one. I was not ready for the conversation that would inevitably follow. It was my granddaughter Emma who blew my cover. She was 9 years old and had a sharp eye and a bigger Instagram following than I had realized. I had agreed, against my better judgment, to allow her to follow my account, a small, mostly dormant profile I had created years ago, to follow recipes and gardening tips. I had posted exactly 3 things in 4 years. In October, I posted a 4th, a photograph of my morning coffee on the terrace, the harbor glittering behind it, with no caption, no location tag, just the image. Emma recognized the building from a vacation she and Claire had taken to the coast the previous summer. She showed her mother. 2 days later, Claire called. I almost didn't answer. When I did, She was already at a volume I recognized the voice she used when she felt wronged, which had always been the voice I rushed to soothe. Not this time. I stood at my kitchen window and watched a fishing boat move across the harbor and let her finish. She wanted to know who had given me the money. She wanted to know why I hadn't told her. She said she'd been worried sick about where I was living, that she'd driven to my old building and the new tenants hadn't known anything, that she'd been about to call the police. I said, "Claire, you told me I was a burden and suggested I work in a care home to earn my room and board. Why would you expect me to tell you anything?" Silence. Then, where did the money come from? I told her about Robert's policy, about the 2 years of paperwork, about the savings account I had left untouched while I kept teaching and sending her checks. I told her the amount. Another silence. A different quality this time. "Mom," she said, and her voice had changed entirely. That's incredible. You must have been so relieved." I waited. "We should talk," she said. "Derek and we've been struggling, actually. With the new development project, there have been some cash flow issues, and the girls' tuition went up again. And I was thinking, I'm going to stop you there," I said. The conversation ended shortly after. I would have been able to absorb the phone call if that had been the end of it, but Derek was not a man who absorbed setbacks quietly. Within a week, I received a certified letter from an attorney informing me that my son-in-law had filed a formal inquiry with my bank, claiming that I was potentially vulnerable to financial exploitation and requesting that a hold be placed on my accounts, pending a competency review. I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat down at my kitchen table in my ridiculous, comfortable condo, and I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what he had done. He had gone to a lawyer. He had, in writing, suggested to a financial institution that I might not be mentally capable of managing my own money so that the money could not be moved, could not be spent, could not be out of his reach while he figured out how to get his hands on it. I was 63 years old. I had a master's degree. I had managed my own household, my own classroom, my own grief, and my own finances for 35 years, without anyone's help. And my son-in-law had just told a bank I might be incompetent. I called Susan, my financial advisor, that afternoon. I called an attorney the next morning. His name was Howard, and he was a small, precise man who wore the same kind of expression Robert used to wear when he was doing math in his head. Howard told me the inquiry had no legal basis. My accounts were in perfect standing, my documentation was thorough, and the bank had already declined to place the hold because there was no evidence of exploitation, only evidence of a woman who had received an insurance payout, hired a financial advisor, and made a legal real estate purchase. He said Derek's attorney had likely known from the beginning it wouldn't succeed but had sent the letter anyway, hoping I would panic. "What do I do?" I asked. "Whatever you'd like," Howard said. "But I'd recommend letting me send them a response that makes very clear what the consequences of a second attempt would look like." I told him to send it. What I did not anticipate was the social media campaign. I had taken my personal Facebook account off public months earlier, but Claire still had access to a neighborhood group we'd both belonged to when I lived in Cedarwood Hills. She posted there first. It was carefully written concerned, not accusatory on the surface. She talked about her elderly mother's sudden personality change, about the suspicious circumstances of a large financial windfall, about her worry that I had isolated myself from family. She did not mention Derek's failed bank inquiry. She did not mention the conversation where they'd told me I was a burden. She posted a photo of the 2 of us from Emma's birthday party 3 years ago, me with my arms around both my granddaughters, all of us laughing. The comments divided almost immediately. Some people expressed sympathy for her concern. Others, mostly women around my age, started asking sharp questions she didn't answer. Derek escalated. He created a separate post with more photos, more detail about the unexplained money, and the phrase, "senior financial exploitation." He tagged a local news station. I found out through my neighbor Dorothy, who was 71 and a retired district judge and had more social media savvy in her little finger than I had accumulated in my entire life. She called me on a Thursday evening and read me Derek's post in a tone that could only be described as professionally disgusted. "He's betting you'll stay quiet," she said. "I always have," I said. "I know," she said. "That's what he's counting on." I did not sleep much that night. I lay in my bed with the window open and listened to the harbor and thought about 35 years of staying quiet. I had stayed quiet when Robert died, and Claire forgot to call me on the first anniversary because she'd been too busy. I had stayed quiet when Derek made a comment at Thanksgiving about how I should think about downsizing while I was still cooking their holiday dinner in their kitchen. I had stayed quiet so long I had nearly disappeared. By morning, I had decided what to say. I asked Dorothy to help me write it. She was methodical and calm and had an instinct for language that cut through sentiment without being cruel. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee and worked for 2 hours. When we finished, it was 4 paragraphs. No photographs, no emotional appeals, just facts, sequenced clearly, with the composed precision of someone who has spent decades explaining things to people who weren't paying attention. The post read, "I have seen the recent social media posts from my daughter and her husband regarding my finances and my circumstances. Out of respect for our family, I had chosen not to respond publicly. Given that the situation has now been brought to a neighborhood forum and a local news outlet, I feel I owe this community the truth. My financial situation changed when I received a life insurance payout from my late husband's policy money he spent years providing to protect my future. I purchased my current home legally, with the guidance of a licensed financial advisor and an attorney. I am in excellent health, of sound mind, and fully capable of managing my own affairs as confirmed in writing by my bank, which declined to act on my son-in-law's inquiry due to a complete absence of evidence. When I announced my retirement, my daughter and her husband informed me that I could no longer live with them as previously promised, suggested I consider a residential care facility with a work program to offset costs, and expressed that I was a financial burden to their household. It was only after they discovered the size of my inheritance that contact was urgently renewed. I have filed a legal response to the inquiry. I will not be making further public statements on this matter, and I ask for the same privacy any member of this community would expect during a difficult family situation." Dorothy posted it at 9 a.m. on a Friday. By noon, it had been shared over 400 times. Former students reached out, former colleagues. 3 women I had never met wrote to say they had experienced something nearly identical. The comments on Derek's original post turned sharply and did not turn back. By Sunday, both his post and Claire's had been taken down. Derek's attorney called Howard to discuss a resolution. Howard told me afterward that the call had been short. The settlement terms were simple. Derek withdrew his bank inquiry in writing and issued a formal statement confirming there was no evidence of any financial exploitation. Claire issued a public retraction, acknowledging that her posts had been misleading. Both of them agreed to cease all public discussion of my finances, permanently. In exchange, I withdrew my notice of legal action. I added one more condition: no contact. 1 year. Claire's voice on the phone when she heard this was very small and very young, and it pulled at something deep in me that I had to work hard to resist. But I thought about Emma and Lily, my granddaughters, about the kind of women they were going to become, about what they were learning by watching their parents behave this way. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a child is show them what a boundary looks like. I said, "When you are ready to speak to me as a person and not as a resource, I will be here." The year that followed was the strangest and most beautiful of my life. I took a watercolor class on Tuesday mornings with 6 other women, most of them older than me, all of them funnier than I expected. I traveled to Santa Fe in October and spent 4 days doing nothing but looking at light on the desert and eating food I'd never tasted. I read 41 books. I learned to make pasta from scratch. I went to a concert for the first time in 11 years and cried through the second movement and didn't care who saw me. I called Robert's sister in Maine and apologized for losing touch. We talked for 2 hours. She came to visit in February, and we walked on the beach in our coats, and I told her everything, and she held my hand without saying much, which was exactly right. Dorothy and I developed a standing Thursday dinner that we rarely canceled. She brought wine. I cooked. We argued about books and politics, and whether the harbor or the mountains was a better view for growing old in, and neither of us ever won, and we didn't need to. I sent monthly photographs to Howard to be forwarded to Claire, not personal messages, just evidence of my wellness for legal documentation purposes, at Howard's suggestion, but I added one thing he hadn't asked for. In each envelope, I included a small drawing, one of my watercolors. I didn't know if Claire opened them. I didn't know if she threw them away. I sent them anyway, because I still loved her. And love doesn't stop just because you've finally learned to protect yourself from it. A month before the no-contact year ended, Howard called to tell me that Claire had reached out to his office. She had asked if I was willing to hear from her. She said she understood if the answer was no. I waited 3 days before I told him yes. We met at a coffee shop in Glenport Neutral Ground, my city. I arrived 10 minutes early and ordered a tea and sat by the window and watched the street. When she walked through the door, she looked like herself but quieter, as if something loud had gone out of her. She had cut her hair short since I'd seen her last. She sat down across from me and said, "I don't know where to start." I told her to start at the beginning. What came out over the next 2 hours was not a prepared speech or a legal statement. It was my daughter talking, stumbling, backtracking, saying things she'd clearly been carrying for a long time. She told me that Derek had been the one to push the bank inquiry, that she had known it was wrong and hadn't stopped him, that she had spent months telling herself she was just protecting me, when she was really protecting his access to money he'd never earned. She told me they were separated. Not divorced yet, but separated, and the girls were adjusting. She told me about a therapist she'd started seeing, and how the first session she'd spent defending herself and the second session she'd cried for 50 minutes straight, and how the therapist had asked her one question that she couldn't get out of her head. "When in your relationship with your mother have you ever asked what she needed?" Claire looked at me across the table. Her eyes were red. "I couldn't answer," she said. I sat there and I couldn't think of a single time. I held my tea with both hands and let the warmth travel up my arms. I thought about every mother who had ever loved a child too completely. Every woman who had folded herself into something small so someone she loved could take up more space. I thought about how easy it is to confuse sacrifice with love, and how the difference only becomes clear when the sacrifice runs out and you see what was underneath. "I'm not asking you to forgive me immediately," Claire said. "I know I don't have the right to ask for that," I said. "I'm not going to tell you that what happened didn't hurt me. It did. It still does, but I also know that the person sitting across from me right now isn't the same person who told me I was a burden." She let out a long breath. "I've been so ashamed." "Good," I said, and when she looked startled, I added, "Shame means something mattered to you. That's not nothing." We stayed for another hour. We didn't resolve everything. We didn't hug when we left, though we stood close enough to that I could feel she wanted to. She told me she'd like to try coffee again, maybe in a few weeks, and slowly from there, I told her I would try too. I walked home along the water with my hands in my coat pockets, and I thought about slow things. Trees, rivers, the way a bruise heals from the edges in, taking its time, having no choice but to move at the pace it moves. 3 months later, I met my granddaughters for lunch. Emma was 10 by then, solemn and observant in the way she had always been, with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and something entirely her own behind both. Lily was 7 and had brought a drawing she'd made specifically for me, a house near the water, a woman standing on a balcony looking out, and in the corner, very small, a sun with a face. I showed it to Dorothy on Thursday. She put it on her refrigerator with a magnet and said, "That child already knows who you are." I thought about Robert, who had quietly arranged all of this, not the conflict, not the pain, but the exit from it, the door out, the life on the other side. He had loved me with the kind of love that plans ahead, that says, "I want you to be free even after I'm gone." And I had carried that love around for years without opening it. I set up education trusts for both girls that December. I did not tell Claire the amount, and she did not ask. And that felt like the first honest exchange we had managed in a long time. She thanked me. I told her it wasn't about her, and she understood what I meant, and she nodded. I was not the woman I had been before all of this. I was not the woman who stayed quiet when staying quiet cost her everything. I was not the woman who measured her worth by what she could give, or the woman who confused other people's comfort with her own happiness. I was 64 years old, and I was learning, very slowly, to take up exactly as much space as I deserved, which, it turned out, was quite a lot.